So, I'm here to talk to you today about doomed point-of-sale systems. So if you're not here for that talk, then I hope you enjoy it anyway. So my name's Nolan Ray. I'm a former security consultant, and I work security engineer now. And I'm sort of an adrenaline junkie, an outdoor day drinker. I'm romantically available, so keep that in mind, you know. And of course, I'm a hacker, which is why I'm here today to talk to you guys about our target, right? So after a couple drinks and eBaying things that make my credit card statement sad later, I bought a whole bunch of these Verifone MX900 series terminals. There's the 915 and the 925. They're pretty similar, so I'm going to mainly focus on the 925. Really, the only difference is the display size. Awesome. So basically, my motivation for this talk is that these things are everywhere. So I hopped out of my cab, actually, or hopped into the cab at the airport on the ride here, and there was actually one of these sitting on the back of the seat. And also, I assumed it would be a pretty hard target, and I love hacking at hard targets. Oftentimes, also, companies use these and actually encryption on these terminals to justify really weak access controls elsewhere in their network. And I don't think that's great. And also, the companies that do care often don't have the internal resources to validate any security claims that vendors make and really investigate the security of these devices themselves. So I wanted to shed some light on that from a third-party perspective. And of course, really, I just love Doom. And I wanted to play Doom on one of these things, and so had to do that. So what this talk is not, this is not an exhaustive comparison of all pin pads or card terminals. And it's not an endorsement or an indictment of any specific vendor. This is just one specific terminal that I decided to go after because I bought enough of them. And that's kind of where this is at. And it's not a guide to configuration or compliance. So if you're here for that, I'm sorry. What this talk is an in-depth dive into one line of devices and how they're hardened, and of course, exploits. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. So previous work that other people have done, you've got lots of more nefarious people who don't want to run Doom and instead want to steal credit cards. And of course, one of their common things is skimmers that they go after. And of course, there was a little while back, Security Research Labs put Pong on a couple payment card terminals, and now that's more along the lines of like work that I support, And then additionally, Cambridge Research Labs, Cambridge Computer Labs actually does a whole bunch of work on tamper resistance of these different terminals and also just general EMV protocol exploits. Pretty cool stuff. Additionally, at RSA, Trustwave and Bishop Fox guys actually presented a survey of previous point-of-sale attacks. And these, previous attacks, analysis of them. And one of the really interesting things that came out of this, at least from our perspective for this talk, is that 90% of these devices actually use the default pin in the field. And that's going to actually matter a lot later as we keep talking. And of course, you've got things like your target breach. So there's that. We all know about that. So let's get knee deep in the dead and dig into the first level and look at how, like, an overview of our device. So the first thing, it runs Linux under the hood. You saw that little Tux penguin in the first photo. They call it VOS, I assume for Verifone OS. And it runs a 400 megahertz ARM11 32-bit RISC processor. And unfortunately, it runs the ARMv6 instruction set. So if you ever had to cross-compile anything for the original Raspberry Pi A and Bs, then you know how much of a pain in the ass it is to cross-compile anything for these devices. But unfortunately, that's where it is. And of course, it has 512 megabytes of RAM, 256 flash, 256 SD RAM, and of course, a 4 or 7-inch display. So this is a massive display. Throw out your home entertainment center, get rid of your gaming computer. This is all you need. Awesome. So connectivity. How do these things talk to the outside world? So what you usually have is there's a lot of different ways, and it completely varies depending on the device configuration and the store configuration. What you see here in this picture is actually an I/O module that you can swap in and out, and that supports Ethernet, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RS-232, these ancient I/O modules from the MX800 series, so if you have some really old hardware. can still use that with your newer payment terminals, and they generally expose the same functionality. That's kind of what matters to us here. You can request a transaction, you can make it display different pages that have already been loaded on the devices, stuff like that. The truly remote attack surface of these devices, because obviously we always want to like have a completely remote exploit. That'd be awesome. But unfortunately, there's only 2 TCP ports open in normal operation, and this is only if you actually have a device that's running the Ethernet module, which a lot of them aren't. And these services expect XML messages, and sometimes you get DHCP. Good luck, writing some DHCP exploit if you've been sitting on an O-day for that for a long time. Maybe talk to me about it. But anyway, so in normal operation of this, you've got this formagent.exe running as user1, and that is actually an ELF binary, so I don't know why it's named .exe. But essentially, that kind of sits there and it handles all the different connectivity, and it communicates with all the configured interfaces. So that's usually USB or Ethernet. And really, it doesn't expose much attack surface. Again, only 2 network ports if you're in, if it's in Ethernet mode. And then there's also several daemons running as different users that expose IPC for privileged operations. So if you want to request a card swipe, that's going on in the background, but you can't directly get to any of that functionality. So really, for normal operation, like when one of these things is running in its normal operation mode, processing credit cards, without physically interacting with it, there's not a lot of attack surface. So what is that physical attack surface, though? So first of all, you've got the smart card reader, magstripe reader. Very limited attack space there. I'm not going to say you couldn't pop an exploit with that, but if you do, I will buy you many beers. There's the USB host port, actually, and that's the lower image of the 2. That leftmost RJ45 jack is not Ethernet. That's actually USB. So these actually support USB host, and you can plug literally any device you want into there. So you can plug in your USB keyboard, anything that there's a driver for. Removable storage. You can get your keyboard and mouse for your gaming rig and stuff like that. That's what's important there. Of course, you've got your USB over serial that usually talks to the host computers if that's the way the device is configured to be communicating with the point of sale system. And you've got several COM ports as well for, of course, more communications operations. And then there's an SD card slot because, of course, on your secure terminal, you want removable storage. Obviously, these aren't really used, and usually they're on the back of the device where it's inaccessible unless you steal it. And there's this Berg port that supports the ancient MX800 series peripherals. So if we want to disassemble one of these and start poking at it, because usually as someone who's a little more low level, my first desire is to go after a hardware exploit, dump the firmware so we can reverse the firmware and exploit things. But it turns out there's a bunch of tamper-resistant hardware in these, and it's actually done pretty well. And it's generally mechanical mechanisms, such as the one pictured here on the left. That's actually a series of traces in the PCB, and if you drill into the PCB, you're going to trip one of them, and then you won't be able to tap into the device. And there's lots of these throughout the device's assembly, and the device really likes to wipe itself if you open it up. So that's kind of unfortunate. But luckily, it's not necessary to get the firmware. So, I'm very lazy. I want to go back to outdoor day drinking, so why bother, doing some elaborate hardware hack and killing a bunch of these devices when it's not necessary. But I did void my warranty, and that I don't think came with the eBay purchase, and tear this apart for your viewing pleasure. You can look at these in the slides later. So really, that's kind of your overall attack surface, but there's this magical mode called administrator mode, and this is great. And what we have here is if you walk up to one of these terminals and you press 159, and then you enter the default PIN, which you can find in the manual online. I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader. And of course, now all of a sudden you have a massively increased attack surface. You still can't load your own arbitrary code on the device, but you can exercise a lot more functionality. You can get all kinds of diagnostic information. So you can get all kinds of software versions and start pulling down those open source pieces of software, reversing them at the code level, look for public CVEs, things like that. And of course, if you actually have signed firmware or signed applications that traces up to the Verifone root of trust, you can install software There's a little bit of attack surface there as far as like, fuzzing the parsing of those those packages and things. But unfortunately for our purposes, and we don't have a signature, a certificate to sign this, so it's not very useful to us. And of course, the software updates, this is a picture pulled from their manual. It basically just says, if you don't have an intermediate certificate signed by Verifone, you're not going to install software on this device. Sorry. And of course, most of the software update mechanisms actually require manual interaction. And so this is going to matter because a lot of these devices in the field don't get software updates. So even though there's a lot of really good software updates that dramatically improve the security of these devices, a lot of them in the field don't get those. And of course, the updates must be signed, so it's not very useful for us to install our video games. So, of course, we can load encryption keys. Again, signatures required. But more interestingly, we can configure a lot of configuration settings. So, for example, we can change all these Ethernet settings and reroute traffic somewhere else. We can essentially change all of the different settings in the user mode program that's running. And most of this can be used, some of this data gets maybe shelled out, or maybe it gets parsed by something, or changes some setting that gives us extra attack surface. So this is all areas you can kind of chase down different rabbit holes looking for exploits. But more interesting is this file manager. This is cool, right? I like managing files. So you can actually use this to copy files off of the device to a removable storage you plug in via the strange RJ45 USB port. But you can't copy anything to the device, unfortunately, because that would violate the whole signature structure. But a creative hacker, since it allows you to copy everything from the entire root file system, a creative hacker might go to proc self and copy some interesting files, and maybe you copy proc self CMD line because you want to find out what binary is running, so that you can actually copy that into IDA and start reversing it and looking for exploits. But when you do that, you might actually see that proc self CMD line is actually CP, your target file, proc self CMD line, mount USB store. So, okay, it's shelling out to copy this. Well, that's interesting. What if we add some strange characters to file names, as a hacker usually does? And of course, with a couple semicolons, some $ IFSs, some weird forward slashes and directory structures, you can actually pop a command injection in this interface, and that gets you your first shell. So great, wow, we've got command execution, we're going along, this is going to be so exciting, except really, we can't do anything. We need to start privilege escalating, because it turns out this binary is actually running as the sys4 user. And the sys4 user actually can't backdoor our our standard user mode application. It can't really get at anything interesting. It can't read the magstripe data. It's pretty boring, that level of access. So we start looking at ways to get root. And unfortunately, there are no SUID binaries on the entire file system. So even if you knew the root password, you couldn't SUID a root because SU is running as sys4. There's only 6 processes running as root, and only 3 of them expose IPC mechanisms. So really, these are your main way of trying to get root on the device. So this is a pretty hardened attack surface. And of course, there's reasonably good file system permissions, and I would say on the newer models, even excellent file system permissions. And so even if you manage to find some kind of issue with those that might let you tweak something to like pop an exploit on startup or something, you're still going to end up with a bunch of grsec issues because functionality is separated by user, but grsec is actually installed in the kernel, and it heavily uses the role-based access controls to kind of mitigate a lot of exploits. And of course, if you're trying to pop a kernel exploit, grsec is going to make you have a bad day. So patch levels, oh my. Under the hood, this device runs the Linux kernel 2.6.31.14. So for those of you who keep track of Linux kernel versions, which is not me, I'm pretty sure it's behind. It's in fact not like it's far enough behind that it's not actually up to date with the 2.6.3.1 line of security patches, but it is grsec. So if you're going to try and pop a kernel exploit, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing that. It uses an outdated libxml2 and also a bunch of other outdated image parsing libraries. So I guess kind of across the devices, you'll see open source softwares often not as updated as it could be, but unfortunately, a lot of that is mitigated. Because especially in the newer versions of these devices, all binaries on the system are actually compiled with fstack protector strong, so all your stack buffer overflows become much harder to exploit. And all writable partitions are actually mounted as no exec. So if you're trying to interact with something that uses, like, say, a sys5 shared memory to pop an exploit, you're going to have a very bad time because you can't actually compile your C code, drop it on the system, and execute it. You're constrained to using what's on the file system already. And so you'd actually have to pop an exploit, a memory corruption vulnerability in something that you can execute as your own user just to be able to load an arbitrary code to exploit something running as another user. And of course, grsec prevents any of those no exec bypasses of the old 2.6 line. And there's also very aggressive grsec role-based access controls. So even if you somehow gain permissions as a different user, you're still fairly constrained about what you can do. And in the newer versions, many bugs are patched, but still not all. There's still a lot of code here that they're slowly churning through fixing bugs, but there's still plenty in there. Now, so let's start looking at those root services, because those are probably our most interesting privilege escalation attack point, because we need to privilege escalate so that we can end up being able to access the frame buffer and run Doom. So first of all, you've got klogd and syslogd and ifplugd. Those are pretty boring, but more interestingly, the three that expose IPC, you've got user local sbin seconds, VFI net control, and SVC net control. The later two, we're going to dive into each one of these. The later two are obviously networking related, and seconds is, interestingly enough, security related, and that's pretty interesting. There's also a ton of non-root services you could try and pivot through to gain more privileges or maybe be able to access the magstripe data, but I didn't take that route. I wanted to go straight to root. So if we download, through our file manager or now our shell, VFI net control and start looking at it, it exposes IPC via VFI net control. It's basically a Unix named pipe. And then it exposes about 8 operations, and they're all networking related, and they're actually pretty boring. So you can pretty quickly reverse all 8 of those handlers, and none of them have exploits, and that makes me sad, and probably people who pay with credit cards happy. However, seconds is much more interesting. Now, this is a security-related binary, and I was like, great, let's go for that next. It handles package installation and security, so there's a lot to learn there. It handles IPC via a Unix socket, and it also handles grsec configuration on startup of the device, which is really interesting. And it also has lots of other interesting functionality, ch-owning files or requesting files to be ch-owned if certain criteria are matched, things like that. And of course, so we want to reverse all this functionality. And it ends up, if you load it up in IDA and take a look at it, it's got essentially an opcode jump table with 22 supported IPC opcodes. And each one of them contains fairly complicated functionality. And if you spend all of your time looking at this and you spend a couple weekends, kind of beating your head against a wall looking for vulnerabilities in each one of these, you'll find out that it's clearly pretty well audited relative to some of the other code that's sitting on this system. I guess it had security in the name, and it probably makes sense that people looked at that. So after that, you'll be really sad, and then decide to maybe try for a softer target and take a look at the only other option that's easy for privilege escalation. So that leads us to SVC net control. This exposes IPC via a sys5 shared memory interface, so it's kind of a pain in the ass to interact with. But it allows limited users to request changes to network interfaces, and so it actually shells out a ton. And so that's obviously pretty interesting. And it exposes numerous different functions. So it lets you set up different network interfaces, add routes through XML, set the NTP server, all kinds of really fun stuff. And it also has this beautiful binary sitting right next to it called SVC net test that exercises a lot of this functionality. So if you're trying to reverse it so that you can, pop an exploit and run Doom, that's pretty handy. Now, of course, this is what that function looks like in IDA. This is the IPC handler, and each one of those little bottom blocks, or most of the bottom blocks, jump off to extremely much more complicated functions that handle all kinds of things. So obviously there's a lot of attack surface here. And so digging into this, I started going through each one of those boxes that calls out and looking for vulnerabilities, because yeah, that's what I do with my life. So eventually I found one that was interesting. I found this SPRNF to PPPD with $S or %S's. So obviously you can see this would potentially be a command injection. But unfortunately, a lot of the shell meta characters are, well, unfortunately for us, a lot of the shell meta characters are actually escaped. However, and spaces are also escaped. But if we look at the manual for PPPD, you'll notice that there's this beautiful connect option that actually allows you to call out to an arbitrary script to set up the environment. And so you can actually, although they've filtered out spaces, they didn't filter out vertical tabs or regular tabs. So you can actually call this IPC handler, and instead of an IP address or with the IP address, add some interesting connect script functionality, and then it'll actually happily execute that for you. As soon as you invoke it. So now all of a sudden this is a service running as root, and it'll execute our arbitrary script. So we get root. Awesome. We're super excited. We're like, root, let's run Doom. Let's start having a party. We'll get a LAN party together with these extra devices. And then GRSEC. This is very unfortunate. GRSEC kind of made me have a nice bad day. And so GRSEC's role-based access controls actually restrict even the root user for most file system access, unless it's specifically running under certain binaries. And so with that, we still can't ptrace seconds, which would be really interesting for dynamic reversing. And there's no access to the magstripe read writer or the smart card reader. And of course, that's unfortunate if you're trying to steal credit card data. And for our purposes, we still can't access the frame buffer, so we can't run Doom, and that's what we want to do. So this is very frustrating. So what are our options? We can continue staring at the seconds IPC handler, hoping that we miss something the first time, because I'm not very good at hacking. Or we can go for a kernel exploit, but unfortunately GRSEC's going to make that very hard. Or we can get creative, and I like to get creative because I want to go back outside and, get away from my computer. So as we're brainstorming, we can start and stop other processes with different GRSEC role-based access controls. So maybe we can find something that does something interesting that we can trick into doing something more interesting. And we can also send signals to other processes. So this is interesting. Maybe we can send a sig9 and tell something to stop in the middle of doing something. That could be interesting. Lots of race conditioning ideas there. And of course, seconds can start and stop GRSEC with gradmin, and it does this on startup or anytime you invoke the binary. And on startup, it actually turns out if you start reversing that code, looking for maybe some kind of exploit you could pop during the boot chain or something, you'll actually find that GRSEC disables the role-based access control, or sorry, seconds disables the role-based access controls, then re-enables them to ensure that the rules are loaded correctly. And it does that instead of refreshing them, and I don't know why. But this is obviously kind of a race condition issue. So you can see here from the binary, there's the GRSEC gradmin password of 123456. However, that doesn't actually get you anything because the role-based access controls stop you from invoking gradmin, which is what you use to disable GRSEC. So you still can't use that password, but what you can see is it sets the password, and then it uses the -D option, re-executes the program to disable the rules, uses the -E option to execute the program and re-enable them. And of course, this is a race to the finish. So we can actually kill the currently running version of seconds, start it up again, wait for it to turn off the role-based access controls, kindly ask it to stop running before it re-enables them. And then we have the GRSEC role-based access controls disabled. So now we have a full chain from the file manager all the way up to running root on these devices. So that's awesome. So that brings us to our demo time. And hopefully I've sacrificed enough to the demo gods that this works. No, there it is. All right, so we've got our terminal here. The screen has changed. This is just a JPEG I swapped out, but I actually got this, and it had the application from the previous company that owned this terminal, so I obviously swapped that out. But here, we'll take a look. No, that's not. Can I remove this? Is this? Yeah. Sorry. All right. Am I on? All right. Well, testing. Oh, there we go. All right, awesome. So we have our device here, and we can walk up to it, and then, so normally you would need to plug in your USB drive. I already have that plugged in just to automate this a little bit faster. The port is exposed on the back in most installations, and we can press our 159. This is going to bring up our administrative mode. Hopefully it's not too washed out, is it? Let's see here. Lower the exposure. There we go. All right. There we go. All right. So then we can enter our password. That's going to bring up our administrative menu here. And then we can actually go into the file manager. Oop. And it's a little touchy. And then go to our root file system, our mount location, our flash drive with strangely named files, lots of strangely named files, and then we can tell it to copy that file, and now our exploit chain is going to run. And this is going to take a minute because I'm bad at coding, and my race condition doesn't successfully win all the time, so I rerun it over and over until it works. So this is going to take just about, it usually takes about 30 seconds. So all the interaction that you've seen so far is all that's actually required for the jailbreak. You can actually walk away from the device at this point. But, and then you could manually script it to like actually go through and, just complete the backdooring and reboot into the main app. But of course, we're going to launch our video game, maybe, if the demo gods love us. I'm going to get a drink of water here. Well, give it one more second. Sometimes Doom takes a second to boot. If not, we'll just run it all again. Of course this would happen. Ran this like 10 times and not a single problem earlier today, of course. Yeah, it's a lot of people back there. And, ooh, all right. Yeah. Some version numbers. Well, let's see here. And yeah, I might switch over to the video. Gonna let this keep going. We'll see. That's frustrating. Oh, no, there it goes. Here we go. All right, it ran. All right. All right. It works. All right, it works. Awesome. So this is a fully playable Doom that we have going on here, so this is pretty cool. So you can actually start a game, and we can like start navigating around, doing this. It's a little clunky, really. It's probably not my ideal gaming system, but we're on a budget, so. So of course, in this modern economy, we have to pay for everything. So I'm going to swipe a card here. This is, I believe, 44444 credit card, and that will trigger some cheat codes and get us an amazing little, that's what we want. Like, that's better. All right, let's see here. Let's attack the barrel. Oh, okay. See, we probably should have got a health plan. So I assume that in a world where hell has come back to Earth, the Republicans are still in Congress, and health plans cost a lot. But luckily, we have a black card here. I don't know if you can. So we have a lot of money, and we can just buy amazing health care. And then we can get God mode, which is pretty cool. And then we'll buy another chainsaw here. And then we'll get that back, and let's see here. Now we can go about the real goal of Doom, which is, I assume, disposing of all these dangerous barrels. Oh, wait, did God mode turn off? Oh, well. Well, even with enough money, sometimes things get you, I guess. But anyway, all right. Cool. Yeah, so that's the demo. Cool. So that's the end of demo time. MC Hammer is sad. All right. So what other interesting input do we have? So if we were a little more nefarious, or we're trying to execute cheat codes when certain credit cards are swiped, there's some interesting input files we can look at. So we've got dev AMSR, which is your magstripe read writer, and now that we're fully jailbroken, we can access all these. You've also got your smart card read writer that allows you to basically transceive protocol messages over via IOCTLs. There's some more stuff that I haven't reversed that looks like it's related to the smart card. And of course, you've got your dev input event 2, which is your pin pad. And that's just a standard keyboard. So you can actually just cat that file, monitor all the scan codes, and then actually just extract people's pins that are entered from that once it's fully jailbroken. Persistence. So if you want to actually persist this, these actually have, because ideally right now, the state that it's in, if I reboot this, it'll be clean. The device actually has a pretty decent secure boot implementation. I'm still kind of looking at that. But essentially what happens is there are software packages that are tar files, and they have a P7S signature file sitting next to them. Basically, these are actually all verified and then extracted onto the file system at boot time. And so it requires, you have to find some kind of either exploit in that parsing code, which is going to be actually kind of hard, because if the parsing fails and you don't immediately pop an exploit, it deletes the package. So the next time you boot up the device, it doesn't have it. So I'd recommend not trying fuzzing that with like something that's system critical, because you'll turn it into a doorstop really fast. And of course, so essentially you're going to need some kind of exploit that runs on boot time. And these are definitely possible to find. So there's lots of config options, things that are parsed, different images and other things that you might be able to go after, drop something that'll get run on boot. But it is going to require a substantial amount of effort to port this over so that it persists across reboots. However, these devices aren't rebooted very often. Data exfiltration. If you want to get data out of the system, you've got your store network / internet. And a lot of these store networks actually allow you to route traffic directly out because they're not secured very well, because they're excited that every credit card number is encrypted on the device. So a lot of times that's an option to you. Or you can plant some type of pwn plug, and if you can't route directly out to the internet, somewhere else within the store network to collect data and send it out. Of course, if the device isn't connected over Ethernet, you can't do that. But again, a lot of times these point-of-sale systems are secured very poorly because they oftentimes merchants rely on these terminals to provide the security. So you can probably either exploit the POS system first and then propagate it down to the terminal, or vice versa. And then, of course, if you have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth as a module, there's an infinite amount of things that you can do to exfiltrate data. You can monitor for a specific MAC address, and then set up a ad hoc AP as soon as you see it, and like send out data over that or something. Lots of ways. You could also write out data over a smart card. Obviously, this requires manually walking up to the terminal and like inserting a smart card to dump them. However, after starting to go down this route, I redid my math, and you can only store about 400 to 500 credit cards numbers like on a smart card. So it's a lot of manual interaction for anything. So it's kind of not that useful. And of course, there's all kinds of interesting side channels you could go on. So even if the store network is completely locked down, and you've also got your point of sale systems hardened very well, you can actually still have a lot of like other side channels. For example, you could exfiltrate data over ultrasonic sound. You could use, of course, there's all these air gapping talks at Black Hat all the time, air gap jumping talks at Black Hat, where you actually use different incidental RF emissions to transmit data intentionally. And of course, one of the more interesting ones is actually LED modulation. You could pretty easily put a camera trained on these devices and actually monitor the LEDs on the side and then modulate them to transmit data out. And that would actually be a pretty effective way to slowly migrate your card, your card database off of the device. And of course, mitigations. So for mitigations, we have obviously don't use the default pin. So it's very important. Everything I presented here today can be eliminated by that, but again, 90% of the ones in the field use this default pin. And so that's very important. That's a first step. Additionally, you really need to have a process in place to actually update the card terminal software on hopefully a fairly regular basis. I mean, even if it's yearly, these terminals actually, their security improves leaps and bounds between different versions of the software. And so getting that on there is very important, even if you only do it once in a while, because unfortunately, it's a pretty intensive process to update these terminals, which is why a lot of times they're not done in the field. And of course, harden the rest of your store network and the point of sale systems that are connected to it. And that's very important to prevent, just defense in depth. So vendor response. Obviously, I reported these issues to Verifone, and they quickly responded to my vulnerability reports, often much quicker than I could actually respond to them. So I thank them for the, being very quick about that. And they were able to produce patches, and in some cases, they had actually already identified these vulnerabilities themselves and patched them. However, unfortunately, a lot of these patches, again, don't get out to devices in the field. But overall, I'd say Verifone was excellent to work with from a vendor perspective, and they didn't sue me, so that's awesome. So takeaways. Use defense in depth to secure the entire store network. That's very important, right? Number one, where there's a will, there's a way. So if you move all of your security to a single device, even if it's well hardened, you can still, someone will still get through. And of course, don't let all your security rely on a single third-party device. And more research should be done into different brands and product lines. So hopefully someone will go out and look at the other brands and see if, this is, if all of them are well hardened like this, or if there's other ones that are more well hardened. It'd be great to get more research that's, kind of in the public eye. And of course, push for audits and transparency and not marketing. And hopefully push for more automatic update mechanisms. Right now, unfortunately, it's pretty hard to update these. And so we actually would, if you have a whole bunch of these in the field, it's very important to go and kind of actually request that the update mechanisms function and function well and allow you to update them on a regular basis. And that's about all I have for you. I'd really like to give some greets out. Thanks very much to Fareed Katak for making my slide deck beautiful, because I don't know how to do anything with any image editing programs. Mike Weber and Samoslav for putting up with my neurotic complaints and worries about this, and also listening to me talk over and over. And Chaos Data as well for putting up with my crap. Richo for taking weird requests from me about ultrasonic stuff, and of course Dean Jerkovich for listening to very early drafts of this presentation multiple times. So thank you very much.